The rain lashed against the windows of the Hartford mansion, each droplet striking like an accusation. Lightning illuminated the grand hallway in harsh momentary flashes, turning familiar surroundings into something sinister. 18-year-old Clara Hartford stood frozen at her bedroom door, one hand clutching the brass handle, the other pressed against her mouth. Through the small crack, she could see her father, Abraham Hartford, the celebrated inventor, whose name graced scientific journals and whose patents had revolutionized steam engines across America. But tonight he looked diminished, backing away from a taller figure whose shadow stretched across the polished floor. "You've stolen enough from me, Cornelius," her father said, his voice trembling with a fury Clara had never heard before. "I won't let you take this too." Cornelius Blackwood stepped forward, his fine ceremonial unruffled, despite the late hour, his silver-streaked hair perfectly combed. He was her father's business partner, a frequent dinner guest, whose smiles had always seemed too practiced to Clara's observant eyes. "Be reasonable, Abraham," Blackwood replied, his tone deceptively soft. "The patents are worthless without proper financial backing. You've always been brilliant with machines, but business requires a different kind of intelligence." "You mean the kind that allows you to falsify ledgers to forge signatures?" Abraham held up a leather-bound journal. "I have proof of everything you've done." Another flash of lightning, and Clara saw something change in Blackwood's expression. Calculation replaced by something colder. He lunged forward, grabbing for the journal. Her father stumbled backward toward the grand staircase. "You'll ruin us both," Blackwood hissed. They struggled at the top of the stairs, two shadows merging in violent choreography. Clara's fingers tightened on the doorknob as she watched Blackwood's hands press against her father's chest. A final push. Her father's arms windmilled as he lost his balance. His eyes widened in the instant before he fell, somehow finding Clara's in that frozen moment. Then he was tumbling down the polished stairs, his body making terrible dull sounds as it struck each step. Clara's scream tore from her throat, but the thunder that cracked overhead swallowed it whole. No one heard. No one but Blackwood, who turned toward her door with predatory stillness. Clara slammed the door shut, sliding to the floor as her legs gave way. She tried to call out again for help, for her sisters, for anyone, but her voice had vanished. Her throat closed as if invisible hands were strangling her. She gasped for air, for sound, for anything. But from that moment on, Clara Hartford would not speak another word. 3 months later, Victoria Hartford stood before her father's grave, spine straight despite the weight that had settled on her shoulders. At 27, she had not expected to become the head of her family so soon, and certainly not under such devastating circumstances. Abraham Hartford had died in prison, convicted of fraud and embezzlement. The charges had been built on forged documents and false testimony, all orchestrated by Cornelius Blackwood. The Hartford name, once synonymous with innovation and integrity, was now whispered with pity and scorn throughout Boston society. "It's time to go, Victoria," said Sophia, placing a gloved hand on her sister's arm. At 25, Sophia was the second oldest a woman whose refinement from Boston's finest women's college masked a surprising knowledge of firearms and explosive skills she had acquired working as a nurse during the war. Behind them stood Lillian, 23, her artist's eyes red-rimmed from crying, but still taking in every detail of the cemetery, as if committing it to memory for some future sketch. And finally, Clara, silent and pale, her gaze fixed on the freshly turned earth that now held their father. "I know," Victoria replied, her voice steady. "There's nothing left for us here. Nothing except debts, gossip, and the constant shadow of Cornelius Blackwood." He had systematically stripped them of everything. Their home would be auctioned by week's end, their father's workshop and inventions already claimed through dubious legal maneuvers. Worst of all, Blackwood had petitioned the court to become their legal guardian, despite the fact that Victoria and Sophia were well into adulthood. "He wants father's remaining patents," Lillian had reasoned when they'd received the news, "and he thinks we might know where father hid his original journals. Or he simply wants to punish us," Sophia had added, her expression darkening. Whatever his motivations, Blackwood's influence with the courts meant his petition stood a good chance of success. The Hartford sisters needed to disappear before that happened. Back in their nearly empty home, Victoria unfolded a newspaper on the table around which they had gathered. It was open to a page of advertisements, one circled in ink. "The Matrimonial Times." Sophia read, her eyebrow arching skeptically. Victoria, you can't be serious. Read the circled advertisement, Victoria instructed, her finger tapping on the page. Lillian leaned forward, reading aloud, "Four brothers seeking brides to help establish thriving cattle ranch in Montana Territory. Strong moral women of good character desired. Sullivan Ranch, Promise Creek, Montana." Four brothers. Her gaze lifted to Victoria's face. "You can't mean that all four of us should respond. That's exactly what I mean." Victoria's voice was calm but firm. "We need to leave Boston and we need to stay together. This is our chance," Sophia scoffed. "Become mail-order brides to strangers in the wilderness. There must be another way." "Is there?" Victoria challenged. "Our funds are nearly depleted. No respectable household in Boston will hire us, not with father's conviction hanging over our heads. Blackwood has seen to that." "But Montana," Lillian whispered, her artistic imagination clearly conjuring images of vast, untamed landscapes. "It's so far." "Precisely." Victoria looked at each of her sisters in turn. "Far from Blackwood's reach. Far from his influence with the courts and the police. Far enough to start again." Clara, who had been listening silently as always, took a piece of paper and pencil from her pocket. She wrote quickly, then pushed the note toward the center of the table. Victoria read it aloud. "I'll go wherever you decide, but I want us to stay together." She squeezed Clara's hand. "That's exactly my intention, dear one. All of us together." Sophia paced the room, her practical mind working through the logistics. "Even if we decided to do this, these men are expecting individual women, not a package of four sisters." "The advertisement mentions four brothers," Victoria countered. "They're seeking four brides. We simply ensure that all four of us are chosen." "And how do we manage that?" Lillian asked. Victoria's expression hardened with determination. "We each write letters emphasizing different qualities we possess. We make ourselves indispensable on paper, and we ensure our letters arrive together, presenting them with a unified choice." For a long moment no one spoke. Then Sophia sighed. "It's madness." "Perhaps," Victoria agreed, "but it's also our best chance." Clara wrote another note. "What if they reject us when they learn the truth?" Victoria looked at her youngest sister, wishing she could promise that wouldn't happen. But she had already resolved to build their new life on as much truth as possible. The deception was merely a means to an end. "Then we'll face that when it comes," she said. "But I believe that once we're there, once we've proven our worth, they'll have no reason to send us away." As her sisters gradually nodded their agreement, Victoria felt the weight on her shoulders shift slightly. It wasn't lighter, but it was more balanced now, shared among the four of them. "There's one more thing," she said, rising to retrieve a package wrapped in brown paper. "We must take this with us." She unwrapped the package to reveal a quilt not particularly beautiful at first glance, with its dark blues and grays but meticulously crafted. Their mother had begun it before her death years ago and had worked on it obsessively during father's arrest and trial. "Mother's memory quilt?" Lillian asked, running her fingers over the fabric. "I don't understand." "Neither do I yet," Victoria admitted, "but father's last words to me during our final prison visit were to keep it safe. He said mother had sewn her heart into it, and perhaps something more." That night, as they packed what little they could carry, each sister contemplated the uncertain future that awaited them. They wrote their letters to the Sullivan brothers, carefully crafting personas that highlighted their strengths while revealing little of their true circumstances. Victoria, writing to the eldest Sullivan brother, emphasized her organizational skills and practical nature. Sophia, targeting the second brother, showcased her education and independence. Lillian wrote of her artistic talents and gentle disposition to the third brother. And for Clara, Victoria helped compose a letter to the youngest Sullivan that spoke of her kind heart and willingness to learn, delicately explaining that she communicated through writing rather than speech. 1 week later, they boarded a train headed west, leaving behind the only home they had ever known. The quilt was carefully folded at the bottom of Victoria's trunk, a mysterious connection to their past traveling with them toward an uncertain future. None of them looked back at Boston as the train pulled away. There was nothing left to see. The Montana Territory stretched before Emmett Sullivan like an unforgiving mirror, vast, harsh, and brutally honest about a man's failings. From the porch of the ranch house, he surveyed land that was still recovering from the harshest winter in memory. The cattle had suffered, their numbers diminished. The crops would need to be exceptional this year to make up for their losses. Emmett's calloused fingers absently traced the scar that ran from his right temple to the corner of his mouth, a habit he'd developed in the years since Shiloh. The wound had healed as well as could be expected, but it had left its mark both on his face and deeper where no one could see. The screen door creaked behind him, followed by the sound of spurs jingling against wooden boards. Gideon, his second in command, and brother stepped out to join him. "Thinking about the cattle again?" Gideon asked, offering Emmett a cup of coffee. "Among other things." Emmett accepted the cup with a nod. At 32, he was 4 years older than Gideon, though sometimes the gap felt wider. The war had aged him, as had the responsibility of keeping his brothers in this ranch alive. Gideon leaned against the porch railing, his posture deceptively casual. Before coming to Montana, he'd made his living as a gambler at St. Louis, and something of that calculated ease remained in his bearing. "I've been thinking," Gideon began in a tone that immediately put Emmett on guard, "about our situation here." "Which part of our situation?" Emmett asked dryly. "The part where we're short-handed, or the part where the bank's getting impatient about our loan?" "Both, actually." Gideon took a sip of his coffee. "And the part where this place needs more than just 4 men to make it work." Emmett turned to look at his brother directly. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we need women." Gideon said it plainly without embellishment. "Not just for, well, the obvious reasons, but because we need more hands, more skills, more of everything if we're going to make this ranch thrive." Emmett stared out at the land again. He'd had the same thought himself but hadn't voiced it. "And how exactly do you propose we find these women?" Promise Creek has all of 3 unmarried females, and 2 of them are over 60. Gideon reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping. "Matrimonial Times, mail-order brides." Emmett almost choked on his coffee. "Mail-order brides, you can't be serious." "Deadly serious." Gideon unfolded the clipping. "It's becoming common out here. Men write in describing themselves and what they're looking for. Women respond. It's straightforward." "It's desperate," Emmett countered. "We are desperate," Gideon reminded him quietly. "This winter nearly broke us, and spring hasn't exactly been kind either." Before Emmett could respond, the screen door opened again. Wesley, the third Sullivan brother, stepped out with a book tucked under his arm. At 25, Wesley was the scholar of the family, his mind as sharp as Emmett's axe. He'd been studying law in Boston before, well before circumstances had required his hasty departure. "What are you two conspiring about?" Wesley asked, his keen eyes moving between his older brothers. "Nothing," Emmett said, just as Gideon replied, "Mail-order brides." Wesley blinked, then actually laughed, a rare sound from him these days. "You're joking." "I'm not," Gideon insisted, handing the clipping to Wesley. "Read it. Think about it logically. We need more people on this ranch, preferably people who can cook, clean, mend, garden, and maybe even help with the books. Where else are we going to find women willing to come to the middle of nowhere?" Wesley scanned the advertisement, his expression shifting from amusement to thoughtful consideration. "It's not entirely without precedent. Many frontier settlements have utilized similar methods to address gender imbalances." "We're not a frontier settlement," Emmett growled. "We're a family. A family that could use some expanding," came a younger voice, as Caleb, the youngest Sullivan at 21, joined them on the increasingly crowded porch. Despite not being related by blood, Emmett had found him orphaned during the war and brought him home. Caleb had the same Sullivan stubbornness in his lean frame. "Not you two," Emmett groaned. Caleb grinned, his youthful face lighting up with characteristic optimism. "I've been eavesdropping, and I think Gideon's right. This place is too quiet, too empty. We need more life here." Emmett looked at his 3 brothers, recognizing the familiar sensation of being outflanked. He sighed deeply. "Even if, and that's a mighty big if I were to consider this madness, there's no guarantee any woman would respond to such an advertisement." "Then we make ourselves sound irresistible," Gideon suggested with a sly smile. "Rugged ranchers with prospects and principles." "Lying to these women from the start seems dishonorable," Emmett said. "Not lying," Wesley corrected. "Strategic emphasis of our better qualities." Caleb's enthusiasm was growing by the second. "I could have a wife, someone to talk to besides you 3 grumpy old men." "You're barely 21, Emmett reminded him. "Old enough to own land, old enough to marry," Caleb countered. Emmett looked at each of his brothers in turn, seeing the determination in their eyes. He knew that expression well. It was the same one their father had worn when he decided to claim this land to build something from nothing. It was the Sullivan inheritance, stronger than any deed or dollar. Fine, he relented finally. You three can write your letters, but leave me out of it. 3 women will be challenge enough for this ranch to absorb. Gideon clapped him on the shoulder. Fair enough. You can remain our confirmed bachelor. More's the pity for the ladies of the world missing out on your sunny disposition. Emmett scowled, but there was no real heat behind it. As his brothers excitedly discussed what to write in their advertisements, he turned back to the land, to the endless work that awaited him. 3 mail-order brides. God help them all. In the weeks that followed, Gideon, Wesley, and Caleb crafted their letters with surprising care. Gideon, ever the gambler, emphasized his ambitions and the ranch's growth potential. Wesley wrote of books and ideas, hoping to find a woman of similar intellectual inclinations. Caleb, earnest to a fault, simply wrote of his dreams for a family and his willingness to work hard for it. Emmett watched this process with a mixture of amusement and concern, but kept his word and stayed out of it. When the responses began to arrive, he made himself scarce, leaving his brothers to sort through the potential matches. The Hartford sisters seemed promising, Wesley remarked one evening as they sat around the kitchen table. Their letters arrived together. They sound well-educated, capable. Sisters. Emmett looked up from his coffee, suddenly interested despite himself. 3 of them, Gideon confirmed. Responding to our 3 letters. Convenient, isn't it? Too convenient, Emmett thought, but kept it to himself. His brothers were grown men. They could make their own decisions, even foolish ones. I like mine, Caleb said, rereading his letter for perhaps the 20th time. Clara, she writes beautifully even if she doesn't speak much. Doesn't speak much? Emmett couldn't help asking. Caleb looked up. Her sister Victoria, the eldest, explained that Clara communicates primarily through writing. Some kind of trauma affected her voice. Emmett frowned. And you're comfortable with that? Why wouldn't I be? Caleb replied with genuine confusion. Words are words, whether spoken or written. Emmett shook his head, marveling at his youngest brother's simple acceptance. Perhaps Caleb was wiser than he gave him credit for. The decision was made. Responses were sent along with train tickets and directions to Promise Creek. A date was set, June 15, 1885, the day that would change the Sullivan Ranch forever. As the day approached, the brothers worked themselves to exhaustion, preparing the house. An additional bedroom was constructed, repairs long postponed were finally completed, and the entire house was cleaned to a standard it hadn't seen since their mother was alive. On the morning of June 15th, all 4 Sullivan brothers stood on the platform at the Promise Creek station, though Emmett had made it clear he was only there for moral support. Gideon had put on his finest vest, a relic from his gambling days. Wesley wore a sober suit that made him look like the lawyer he'd almost become. Caleb had polished his boots until they gleamed and had slicked back his sandy hair with precious pomade. Emmett, by contrast, had made no special effort. His everyday work clothes and weathered hat were good enough for meeting his brother's mail-order brides. He wasn't the one getting married, after all. The stagecoach appeared on the horizon, a plume of dust marking its approach. Emmett felt his brothers tense beside him, their nervous energy almost palpable. Remember, he said quietly, if any of these women seems unsuitable, or if you have any doubts whatsoever, there's no obligation. Better to face disappointment now than misery later. Always the optimist, Gideon muttered, but there was a slight tremor in his normally steady hands. The coach thundered into town, the horses' hooves striking sparks from the rocky ground as the driver pulled them to a halt. Dust swirled around the vehicle, momentarily obscuring it from view. Sullivan delivery, the driver called out with a laugh as he set the brake. The coach door swung open. The brothers collectively held their breath. A young woman emerged first, her movements graceful despite the journey's rigors. She was petite with delicate features and wide, expressive eyes. She turned back to help the next passenger, revealing a cascade of light brown hair tied back with a simple ribbon. That's her, Caleb whispered, his face transformed by wonder. That's Clara. Next came a taller woman with an artist's observant gaze, her hands ink-stained despite obvious attempts to clean them. Her dress was simple but adorned with intricate embroidery that even Emmett, no connoisseur of women's fashion, could recognize as skillfully done. Lillian, Wesley murmured, straightening his already immaculate collar. The third woman to descend had a confident bearing that immediately drew attention. Her posture was perfect, her movements precise, and her gaze assessment. She wore a practical traveling suit but carried herself like someone accustomed to finer things. Her eyes found Gideon, immediately measuring him with a glance that seemed to take inventory of both virtues and flaws. "Sophia," Gideon said under his breath, a gambler recognizing a worthy opponent. Emmett began to relax. 3 brothers, 3 brides, all according to plan. But then a fourth figure appeared in the doorway of the coach. She was tall, with dark hair swept back from a face that managed to be both handsome and feminine. Unlike her sisters, who displayed varying degrees of uncertainty, this woman surveyed her surroundings with calm authority. Her gaze moved over the brothers, assessing each in turn before finally settling on Emmett. There was something in her steady regard that made him straighten, made him suddenly conscious of his work-worn clothes and the scar on his face. It wasn't judgment he saw in her eyes, but something perhaps more unsettling, understanding. "Mr. Sullivan," she asked, her voice clear and steady as she descended from the coach. Gideon stepped forward. "Gideon Sullivan, ma'am. And these are my brothers, Wesley, Caleb, and our eldest Emmett." The woman nodded as if confirming something to herself. "I'm Victoria Hartford. These are my sisters, Sophia Lillian, and our youngest Clara." A moment of confused silence followed as the brothers exchanged glances. 4 women, not 3. "There seems to be some confusion," Emmett finally said, finding his voice. "We were expecting 3 ladies, not 4. Victoria's composure never wavered, though something flashed in her eyes, concern perhaps or determination. The advertisement in the Matrimonial Times mentioned 4 brothers at the Sullivan Ranch seeking wives. "I didn't place an advertisement," Emmett said, his voice low enough that only those on the platform could hear. Victoria produced a folded newspaper clipping from her handbag. "This states otherwise, Mr. Sullivan." Emmett took the paper, scanned it quickly, and felt his jaw tighten. The advertisement did indeed mention 4 brothers, though he'd never agreed to be included. He looked at Gideon, who had the grace to appear slightly abashed. "A simple misunderstanding," Gideon offered. "One that has brought 4 women halfway across the country," Emmett replied, keeping his anger in check only because of the audience. Victoria Hartford watched this exchange with keen eyes, clearly cataloging every word, every reaction. "Perhaps we should discuss this somewhere more private," she suggested, her tone making it clear it wasn't really a suggestion. Emmett found himself nodding before he'd consciously decided to agree. "The wagon's this way," he said, gesturing toward where their large farm wagon waited. "We can talk at the ranch." As his brothers helped the Hartford sisters with their trunks and assisted them into the wagon, Emmett pulled Gideon aside. "What were you thinking?" he demanded in a harsh whisper. "I was thinking we needed 4 wives, not 3, Gideon replied. "You need someone too, Emmett. You've been alone too long. That wasn't your decision to make." "No, but it's made now." Gideon looked over at the Hartford sisters, who were being settled into the wagon by Wesley and Caleb. "And I'd say it worked out rather well. That Victoria seems like she could handle even you." Emmett's retort died on his lips as he followed Gideon's gaze. Victoria Hartford stood tall beside the wagon, her back straight, as she surveyed the town. There was something in her bearing that spoke of strength, of resilience. Not the delicate femininity he might have expected from an Eastern lady, but something more substantial. Still, this wasn't what he had agreed to. As he climbed onto the wagon seat and took up the reins, Emmett made a silent resolution he would make the situation clear once they reached the ranch. Victoria Hartford might have traveled far, but she hadn't come for him regardless of what his interfering brothers might have arranged, and he certainly hadn't sent for her. The journey to the Sullivan Ranch was filled with awkward silence, punctuated by Caleb's enthusiastic commentary on the landscape. Clara Hartford smiled at his observations, but remained silent, occasionally writing notes in a small book she kept in her pocket. Wesley and Lillian exchanged tentative questions about books and art, while Gideon and Sophia seemed engaged in some sort of verbal sparring disguised as polite conversation. Victoria sat beside Emmett on the driver's bench, her posture never relaxing despite the jolting of the wagon over the rough trail. Neither spoke until they crested the final hill and the Sullivan Ranch came into view below them. The main house stood proud against the backdrop of distant mountains, a 2-story structure of solid logs with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Several outbuildings clustered nearby: a barn, a smokehouse, a workshop. Fields stretched to the east, while to the west, pasture land rolled toward the horizon. It wasn't the largest ranch in the territory, but it was substantial, and every inch of it had been built by Sullivan hands. "It's beautiful," Victoria said quietly, and Emmett was surprised by the genuine appreciation in her voice. "It's a work in progress," he replied, unable to keep a hint of pride from his tone. "Our father started with nothing but a claim and a dream. We've expanded since taking over." Victoria nodded her eyes, taking in every detail. "How many acres?" 3,000, give or take. About half grazing land for the cattle, the rest divided between crops and timber. "And the four of you manage it alone?" There was no judgment in her question, only a practical assessment. "We hire extra hands during roundup and harvest," Emmett explained. "But day to day, yes, it's just us." Victoria's gaze swept over the property once more. "No wonder you placed the advertisement." Emmett opened his mouth to correct her, to explain again that he hadn't placed any advertisement, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was the weariness he glimpsed beneath her composed exterior, or the protective glances she kept casting toward her sisters. These women had traveled far, driven by reasons he didn't yet understand. The least he could do was offer them hospitality before sending them away. "We'll get you all settled," he said instead. "You must be tired after your journey." As they approached the house, Emmett couldn't help noticing how the Hartford sisters drew closer together, an instinctive formation that spoke of long practice. Victoria at the front, Sophia slightly behind, and to her right, Lillian and Clara protected in the center. It reminded him of soldiers he'd known, men who'd fought side by side so long they moved as one unit. These women were running from something or someone. He was certain of it now. The wagon pulled up to the house, and the brothers helped the sisters down. As they gathered the trunks and bags, Emmett made a decision. He would offer them shelter for the night, perhaps even a few days to rest. Then he would have a private conversation with Victoria Hartford about their true circumstances and the miscommunication regarding his involvement. Together, they would find a solution that didn't involve him taking a mail-order bride he'd never asked for. But as he watched Victoria organize her sisters with quiet efficiency, her gaze constantly sweeping their surroundings, as if assessing for threats, Emmett felt a reluctant spark of admiration. Whatever her secrets, Victoria Hartford was a woman of substance. And despite his best intentions, he found himself curious to discover what had brought her to his door. Victoria Hartford had faced many challenges in her 27 years, but none quite like the sinking feeling that gripped her as she realized their carefully laid plans were already unraveling. Emmett Sullivan, the eldest brother, to whom she had addressed her letter, had clearly not been expecting a bride. As the Sullivan brothers showed them into the ranch house, Victoria's mind raced through possible solutions. They could try to continue with their original plan, hoping that the 3 matches already made would secure their position. Or perhaps they could convince Emmett Sullivan that having a 4th woman to help with the ranch would be advantageous even without marriage. The interior of the Sullivan home was surprisingly spacious, with high ceilings and large windows that let in the afternoon light. It was clean but Spartan, clearly a house run by men with little time for decorative touches. Victoria noted with approval the solid construction and thoughtful layout. Whoever had built this place had done so with care and foresight. "We've prepared rooms upstairs," Wesley Sullivan explained, gesturing toward a wooden staircase. "We thought, well, we expected 3 of you, so we may need to make some adjustments." "We're accustomed to sharing," Victoria assured him. 2 rooms would be more than sufficient." "Nonsense," Emmett said, his deep voice drawing all eyes to him. "We have 4 bedrooms upstairs. Each of you can have your own space." Victoria nodded her thanks, though she suspected Clara would end up in her room regardless. Her youngest sister hadn't slept alone since the night of their father's death. "We'll give you time to freshen up," Emmett continued. "Dinner in an hour." With that settled, the brothers carried the trunks upstairs, showing each sister to a bedroom. Victoria's was the last at the end of the hall, a corner room with windows facing both east and north. The furnishings were simple: a bed, a dresser, a washstand, and a small writing desk, but everything was clean and sturdy. When the footsteps of the Sullivan brothers had retreated downstairs, Victoria's sisters quickly converged in her room, closing the door behind them. "What do we do now?" Sophia demanded in a whisper. The eldest brother clearly didn't send for a bride. "We adjust our plans," Victoria replied calmly, though she felt anything but calm. 3 matches are better than none. And what about you? Lillian asked, her artistic sensibility making her more attuned to emotional nuances. You are counting on securing your own position here. Victoria squared her shoulders. I'll make myself useful in other ways, perhaps as a housekeeper or cook. Clara pulled out her notebook and quickly wrote, "We should tell them the truth about why we're really here." Victoria read the note and sighed. "Not yet, Clara. We need to establish ourselves first, gain their trust." She looked at each of her sisters in turn. "For now, we proceed as planned. Make yourselves indispensable. Show them what capable women can bring to this ranch." After freshening up as best they could with the limited facilities, the Hartford sisters descended to the dining room. The Sullivan brothers had clearly made an effort. The table was set with mismatched but clean dishes, and the aroma of beef stew filled the air. Dinner was an awkward affair at first, with halting conversation and too many eyes carefully not meeting. But gradually, as hunger overcame self-consciousness, a more natural rhythm emerged. Wesley and Lillian discovered a shared appreciation for Whitman's poetry. Gideon told stories of frontier characters that made even the reserved Sophia smile. Caleb, his enthusiasm irrepressible, described the ranch's operations to Clara, who nodded and wrote occasional questions in her notebook. Victoria found herself seated at the opposite end of the table from Emmett, a position that allowed her to observe him without being obvious. He spoke little, but she noticed how his brothers deferred to him in subtle ways, glances seeking approval, questions directed his way when decisions were mentioned. He carried his authority lightly but unmistakably, a man accustomed to responsibility. The scar that ran down one side of his face gave him a forbidding appearance at first glance, but Victoria had quickly looked past it. She was more interested in his eyes, watchful, intelligent, and carrying a shadow of something that looked like her own burden of responsibility. As the meal concluded, Emmett cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "We should discuss the situation," he said directly. "There's been a misunderstanding." Victoria tensed, preparing herself for the rejection she'd feared since their arrival. "I didn't place an advertisement for a bride." Emmett continued, his gaze meeting Victoria's across the table. "My brothers did that without my knowledge or consent." "I see," Victoria replied, keeping her voice steady. "That puts us in an awkward position." "It does," he agreed, "but not an insurmountable one." Emmett looked around the table, taking in all 7 faces watching him expectantly. "You've traveled a long way, and regardless of how you came to be here, you deserve hospitality. I propose you stay for 1 month. During that time, you can get to know the ranch, the territory, and decide if this is truly where you wish to settle." "And after that month?" Victoria asked, hardly daring to hope. "After that, we'll revisit the situation," Emmett said. "If my brothers and your sisters wish to proceed with marriage, that will be their choice. As for you and I, Miss Hartford," Victoria held her breath. "We can discuss other arrangements," he finished. "Perhaps a position as housekeeper, if that would be agreeable." Relief washed over Victoria so strongly she almost swayed in her chair. 1 month. They had 1 month to secure their place here, to prove their worth, to establish a new life far from Cornelius Blackwood's reach. "That is most generous, Mr. Sullivan," she said, infusing her voice with genuine gratitude. "We accept your offer." Around the table, her sisters nodded their agreement, though Sophia's tight expressions suggested she would have words for Victoria later. "Then it's settled." Emmett rose from his chair. "Tomorrow we'll show you around the ranch and discuss duties. For tonight, get some rest. Dawn comes early here." As the group dispersed for the evening, Victoria caught Emmett's arm in the hallway, waiting until they were alone before speaking. "Thank you," she said simply, "for your kindness to my sisters." Emmett studied her face for a long moment, and Victoria had the distinct impression he was seeing more than she intended to reveal. "There's something you're not telling me, Miss Hartford." It wasn't a question, so Victoria didn't treat it as one. "We all have our reasons for the paths we choose, Mr. Sullivan." "Indeed we do," he agreed, his expression softening slightly. "And sometimes those reasons are worth respecting, even when they remain unspoken." With a slight nod, he turned and walked away, leaving Victoria to wonder if perhaps Emmett Sullivan had secrets of his own ones that might help him understand hers when the time came to share them. That night, as she had predicted, Clara slipped into Victoria's room, her small form shivering despite the warm June air. Wordlessly, Victoria lifted the quilt and made space for her sister beside her. "It's going to be all right," she whispered into Clara's hair as the younger girl curled against her side. "We're safe here." I promise. But as she stared at the unfamiliar ceiling of the Sullivan Ranch house, Victoria wondered if that was a promise she could keep. They had escaped Boston and Blackwood's immediate reach, but for how long? The man had resources connections. If he was determined to find them, and she had no doubt he was a month, might not be enough time to disappear completely. She thought of the quilt tucked safely in her trunk of her father's cryptic final words about it. Whatever secret it held might be their only real protection against Blackwood. She needed to unravel its mystery, and soon. But for now, with Clara's breathing slowly evening into sleep beside her, Victoria allowed herself a moment of cautious hope. They had found shelter. They had bought time. And perhaps in this remote corner of Montana, they had found allies who might stand with them when Blackwood inevitably came. It wasn't everything she had planned for, but it was a beginning. And Victoria Hartford had learned long ago that beginnings, however uncertain, were infinitely preferable to endings. Outside her window, the vast Montana sky glittered with stars undiminished by city lights, a ceiling of diamonds over their newfound sanctuary. Victoria finally closed her eyes, surrendering to exhaustion as the Sullivan Ranch settled into night around them. The first week at Sullivan Ranch unfolded in a rhythm of discovery and adjustment. Each morning, Victoria woke before dawn, the habits of a lifetime not easily abandoned. She would slip from bed, careful not to disturb Clara, and stand at the window watching as the sky transformed from inky darkness to the soft lavender of approaching day. The land looked different in these quiet moments, less harsh, more full of possibility. Victoria could almost understand what had drawn the Sullivan family to this remote corner of Montana, what had compelled them to carve a life from wilderness. By the time the household stirred, she was already dressed and downstairs, coffee brewing on the cast iron stove. It was a small gesture, but she had noted how Emmett's expression softened slightly at the first sip each morning, the barely perceptible nod of approval that felt strangely like a victory. The Hartford sisters had divided the household duties with practiced efficiency. Victoria managed the kitchen and overall household organization. Sophia, with her practical nature, took charge of the pantry, smokehouse, and cellar. Lillian applied her artistic eye to mending and home improvements, while Clara, though silent, proved remarkably adept with the chickens and garden. The transformation of the Sullivan home was subtle but unmistakable. Meals appeared on time, served on tables with actual tablecloths. Mended curtains softened the harsh sunlight. The perpetual layer of dust that had settled over everything gradually surrendered to determined cleaning. "It's almost civilized around here now," Gideon remarked on the seventh evening, leaning back in his chair after a dinner of roast beef and fresh-baked bread. "I'd forgotten what it was like to have meals that didn't involve beans or salt pork." "Don't get too comfortable," Sophia responded dryly. "We're still evaluating whether Montana suits us." But Victoria noticed how her sister's critical gaze had softened when it fell on Gideon. For all her prickly exterior, Sophia was not immune to the undeniable charm of the second Sullivan brother. Similar changes were occurring throughout the household. Wesley and Lillian could often be found with their heads bent over a book, deep in discussion about literature or art. Caleb had taken to carrying a small slate and chalk, allowing him to converse with Clara without her having to write everything down. His patience with her silence had endeared him to all the Hartford sisters. Only Emmett remained somewhat apart, his days spent largely outside the house managing the endless work of the ranch. Victoria saw him primarily at breakfast and dinner, their interactions limited to practical matters of household management. Yet she was acutely aware of his presence, even when he wasn't in the room. The sound of his boots on the porch, the low rumble of his voice, giving instructions to his brothers, the weight of his gaze when he thought she wasn't looking. On the eighth day, Victoria rose as usual before dawn, but instead of remaining at the window, she decided to step outside. The air held the crisp freshness that preceded the day's heat, carrying scents of pine and wild grass. She had just settled on the porch steps, coffee cup warming her hands, when the door opened behind her. Emmett appeared, pausing briefly when he saw her, then carefully closing the door. "You're up early," he said, his voice rough with disuse. "I've always preferred mornings," Victoria replied, gesturing to the empty space beside her in silent invitation. After a moment's hesitation, Emmett sat, leaving a respectable distance between them. The porch step creaked beneath his weight. "How are you finding Sullivan Ranch?" he asked, staring out at the landscape rather than at her. "It has potential," Victoria answered honestly, "though I suspect it's more demanding than my sisters anticipated." Emmett's mouth quirked in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Frontier life isn't for everyone. My sisters are stronger than they appear, Mr. Sullivan. I'm beginning to see that. He glanced at her, then a quick assessment. And you as frontier life what you expected? Victoria considered the question. I didn't come with many expectations, only necessities. Something in her tone must have revealed more than she intended because Emmett's gaze sharpened. You're running from something. It wasn't a question, and Victoria didn't treat it as one. She sipped her coffee, letting silence settle between them. Or someone, Emmett added after a moment, his voice softer. Victoria looked at him, then really looked at him. In the gentle dawn light, his scar seemed less harsh, more a testament to survival than disfigurement. His eyes held understanding rather than judgment. We all have our reasons for being here, Mr. Sullivan, she said finally. Even you. His hand moved unconsciously to his scar fingers, tracing its familiar path. Shiloh, he said simply. Artillery shell. I was luckier than most. Victoria nodded, recognizing the offering for what it was, not the full story, but a piece freely given, an invitation to reciprocate. Boston became untenable for my family, she said carefully. After my father's death, there were complications. Legal complications, among others. Emmett studied her face. Your father, what was his profession? He was an inventor. Victoria replied, a hint of pride warming her voice despite everything. Abraham Hartford. His work with steam valves revolutionized factory efficiency throughout New England. Recognition flickered in Emmett's eyes. Hartford valves. I read about them during the war. They said they saved hundreds of lives on naval vessels. Yes. Victoria hadn't expected him to know her father's work, and the recognition brought a sudden, sharp pang of grief. That was his proudest achievement. And yet you left everything behind to come here, Emmett observed. That suggests something more than just complications. Victoria stared into her coffee cup. My father died in prison, Mr. Sullivan, convicted of fraud and embezzlement crimes he did not commit. Emmett was silent for a long moment, absorbing this. I'm sorry, he said finally, his voice genuine. That cannot have been easy for any of you. It wasn't. Victoria raised her eyes to the horizon where the sun was just beginning to breach the distant mountains. Clara was particularly affected. She hasn't spoken since it happened. The trauma affected her voice. Victoria hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. In a manner of speaking, yes. Before Emmett could press further, the door opened behind them. Gideon emerged, looking surprised to find them sitting together. Well, good morning, he said, his tone suggesting he had found them in a far more compromising position than simply sharing coffee on the porch steps. Don't let me interrupt. You're not interrupting anything, Emmett said, standing abruptly. I was just heading out to check the north pasture. He nodded briefly to Victoria, then descended the steps and strode toward the barn, his shoulders set in a rigid line. Gideon watched him go, then turned to Victoria with a raised eyebrow. My brother isn't known for his conversational skills. You must have made quite an impression. Victoria rose, brushing dust from her skirt. We were simply discussing household matters, Mr. Sullivan. Of course you were, Gideon replied with a knowing smile that reminded her forcefully of Sophia. And please, it's Gideon. Mr. Sullivan makes me look over my shoulder for my father. As Victoria returned to the kitchen to begin breakfast preparations, she reflected on the brief conversation with Emmett. She had revealed more than she'd intended, yet somehow less than she'd wanted to. There was something about him that invited confidence, a steadiness, perhaps, or the sense that he carried his own burdens without complaint. But trust was a luxury the Hartford sisters could not afford, not until they were certain of their safety. And despite the growing comfort of their life at Sullivan Ranch, Victoria never forgot that Cornelius Blackwood was undoubtedly searching for them, his resources far greater than their own. That evening, after the household had retired, Victoria gathered her sisters in her bedroom. Clara curled on the bed while Sophia paced and Lillian perched on the windowsill. It's been over a week, Victoria began quietly. We should discuss our situation. The Sullivan brothers seem decent enough, Sophia admitted, though she made the concession grudgingly, even if this place is impossibly remote. I like it here, Lillian said, surprising them all with her conviction. There's a freedom I never felt in Boston, and Wesley is remarkably well-read for a rancher. Victoria smiled at her middle sister's flushed cheeks. And you, Clara, what do you think of our new home? Clara pulled out her notebook and wrote quickly, Caleb is kind. He doesn't treat me like I'm broken. No one thinks you're broken, dear, Victoria assured her, though she understood what Clara meant. In Boston, after her silence began, people had treated Clara with a mixture of pity and discomfort, as if her inability to speak had somehow diminished her worth. So, we stay, Sophia asked, cutting to the heart of the matter as always. Victoria nodded slowly. For now, yes, but we must remain vigilant. Blackwood won't have given up searching for us. We're thousands of miles from Boston, Lillian pointed out. How would he even know where to look? Money has a way of opening doors and loosening tongues, Victoria replied grimly. And Blackwood has plenty of it. Clara wrote another note. We should tell them the truth about why we're really here. Victoria had been pondering the same question. Perhaps, but not everything, not yet. We'll tell them we're fleeing legal complications following our father's death. That's true enough without revealing the danger Blackwood poses. And what about, Sophia gestured vaguely at Victoria, your situation with Emmett Sullivan? He didn't send for a bride and you've no guarantee he'll want one, especially one with our complications. Victoria had been avoiding this particular problem, but Sophia, as usual, refused to let her ignore it. Emmett has offered me a position as housekeeper if nothing else. That would allow me to stay with you all, regardless of how your relationships with the other brothers to develop. As a servant in our household, Sophia's expression made her opinion of this arrangement clear. Victoria, that's a practical solution, Victoria interrupted firmly. My priority is keeping us together and safe. Pride is a luxury we can no longer afford. The conversation continued late into the night as the sisters weighed their options in their growing attachments to the Sullivan brothers. No firm decisions were made, but by the time they returned to their separate rooms, though, Clara remained with Victoria. A consensus had emerged. Sullivan Ranch offered them safety and possibility. For now, that was enough. The following days settled into a pattern as the Hartford sisters and Sullivan brothers gradually adjusted to their shared existence. The awkwardness of their unusual arrangement never entirely disappeared, but it was softened by daily interactions and small moments of connection. Gideon and Sophia developed a spirited rivalry over chess, their matches extending late into the evening, neither willing to concede defeat. Wesley began teaching Lillian to ride his usual reserve melting as he guided her through the basics of horsemanship. Caleb and Clara tended the garden together, communicating through notes, gestures, and, increasingly, a private language of signs they were developing. Victoria maintained her distance from Emmett, though their early morning conversations on the porch had become something of a ritual, brief exchanges as the day began, revealing little yet somehow deepening their understanding of each other. On the 14th day of their stay, Victoria decided it was time to examine her mother's quilt more thoroughly. Her father's final instruction to keep it safe had weighed on her mind, but the demands of establishing their place at Sullivan Ranch had taken precedence. With the household occupied with various tasks, Victoria retreated to her room and carefully removed the quilt from her trunk. She spread it across the bed, studying its pattern with a newfound attention. At first glance, it appeared to be a traditional design of dark blues and grays, somber colors, that had seemed at odds with her mother's usual preference for brightness. But as Victoria examined it more closely, she noticed subtle irregularities in the stitching along the borders. She was tracing these with her finger when a knock at the door startled her. Hastily folding the quilt, she called, "Come in." Lillian entered, her cheeks flushed from her writing lesson. "Victoria, you won't believe..." She stopped noticing the quilt. "Mother's memory quilt. I haven't seen that since Boston." "Father told me to keep it safe," Victoria explained, unfolding it again. "His last words to me. I've been wondering if there might be more to it than sentiment." Lillian approached her artist's eye, immediately drawn to the details Victoria had been examining. "These stitches are different," she said, running her finger along the border. "See how they're almost invisible against the fabric, and they don't follow the pattern." Victoria leaned closer. "They almost look like writing." "They do," Lillian agreed, excitement building in her voice. "Mother was meticulous with her needlework. These irregularities would never have been accidental." The sisters bent over the quilt, trying to decipher the tiny, nearly invisible stitches. After several minutes, Lillian straightened with a gap. "It's a code," she said. "Look, these aren't random stitches. They're numbers and letters arranged in sequences." Victoria saw it in now what had appeared to be decorative elements, but they were actually carefully disguised notations. What does it mean? I'm not sure yet, Lillian admitted, but I think Mother was creating a key of some kind. Before they could discuss it further, another knock sounded at the door. Victoria quickly folded the quilt and again as Sophia entered. There you both are, Sophia said, her expression unusually serious. We have a visitor in town asking questions about four sisters from back east. Gideon just returned with the news. Victoria felt her blood run cold. What kind of questions? Their names when they arrived where they're staying. Sophia closed the door behind her. Gideon didn't speak to him directly, but apparently he's dressed like a city man, not a local. Blackwood, Lillian whispered, fear tightening her features. Or someone working for him, Victoria said grimly. She glanced at the partially folded quilt. We need to figure out what this means and quickly. Where's Clara? With Caleb in the garden, Sophia replied. Should I get her? Victoria shook her head. No, let her be for now. There's no point alarming everyone until we know more. She carefully refolded the quilt and returned it to her trunk. Sophia fined Wesley. His legal knowledge might help us understand what Father and Mother were trying to preserve. Lillian continued working on deciphering the stitches. I'll speak with Emmett. Are you going to tell him everything? Sophia asked, her expression concerned. Victoria hesitated. As much as necessary. We may need the Sullivans' help sooner than we anticipated. As her sisters dispersed to their task, Victoria steeled herself for the conversation ahead. She had hoped for more time to establish trust, to strengthen their position at the ranch, to decipher the quilt's secret. But circumstances had once again forced her hand. She found Emmett in the barn repairing a broken harness with practiced efficiency. He looked up as she entered, his expression shifting from concentration to concern when he saw her face. What's happened? He asked without preamble. Victoria appreciated his directness. There's a man in town asking questions about us. A city man not from these parts. Emmett's hand stilled on the leather. I see, and this concerns you because we left Boston under difficult circumstances, Mr. Sullivan. Victoria took a deep breath. I haven't been entirely forthcoming about our situation. I gathered that much, Emmett said dryly, setting aside the harness and giving her his full attention. Perhaps now would be a good time for honesty. Victoria nodded, choosing her words carefully. As I mentioned, our father died in prison, convicted of crimes he didn't commit. What I didn't explain was that those false charges were orchestrated by his business partner, Cornelius Blackwood. Emmett's expression remained neutral, but his eyes sharpened. For what purpose? To gain control of my father's patents and intellectual property, Victoria explained. After father's conviction, Blackwood systematically stripped us of everything: our home, our possessions, our standing in society. And then he petitioned the court to become our legal guardian. Even though you and Sophia are of age, he claimed it was for Clara's benefit, as she's still a minor. But his real motivation was to control all of us, to ensure we couldn't challenge his ownership of our father's work. Emmett considered this, his gaze steady on her face. And you believe this man in town might be connected to Blackwood? It seems too coincidental otherwise, Victoria said. We took great care to cover our tracks, but Blackwood has resources we don't. What exactly are you afraid of, Miss Hartford? Emmett asked quietly. That he'll force you to return to Boston. Victoria hesitated, then decided that partial truth would no longer suffice. I'm afraid he'll do whatever is necessary to protect his interests. Blackwood is not a man who accepts defeat gracefully. Understanding dawned in Emmett's eyes. You're saying he's dangerous? Extremely. Emmett was silent for a long moment, his scarred face unreadable. Then he rose, his movements deliberate. Gideon, Shin, he called, his voice carrying to where his brother was working nearby. Gideon appeared in the barn doorway, his expression curious. Problem. Ride into town, Emmett instructed. Find out everything you can about this visitor, where he's staying, who he's talked to, how long he plans to remain. Be discreet. Gideon glanced between Emmett and Victoria, clearly sensing the tension. Anything else I should know? Just that the Hartford sisters' privacy is a matter of importance to this family, Emmett said firmly. Gideon nodded, recognizing the seriousness in his brother's tone. I'll go now. When he had departed, Emmett turned back to Victoria. Is there anything else I should know? Anything that might help me protect you and your sisters? The question was so direct, so sincere, that Victoria found herself wanting to tell him everything about Claro, witnessing their father's death, about the quilt's mysterious code, about the gnawing fear that had been her constant companion since leaving Boston. But years of caution held her back. "Not at present," she said finally, "but I appreciate your willingness to help us." Emmett studied her face, and Victoria had the distinct impression he saw more than she intended to reveal. "Whatever you're not telling me," he said quietly, "I hope it's not something that will endanger my family." The implied criticism stung, but Victoria couldn't fault his concern. "The danger is to us, Mr. Sullivan, not to you or your brothers. If it becomes otherwise, you'll be the first to know." He nodded, accepting this for now. "Stay close to the ranch house until Gideon returns with more information." And Victoria, he used her given name for the first time, the sound of it unexpected and strangely intimate on his lips. Trust goes both ways. With that, he returned to his work, leaving Victoria to contemplate the growing complexity of their situation and of her feelings toward Emmett Sullivan. Gideon returned late that afternoon, his usually carefree demeanor replaced by uncharacteristic seriousness. The household gathered in the main room as he reported his findings. "His name is Isaiah Pierce," Gideon began, addressing the group but focusing primarily on Emmett. "Says he's a private investigator from back east. He's been asking at the hotel, the saloon, even the general store about 4 sisters recently arrived from Boston." Victoria and Sophia exchanged worried glances. Clara, seated beside Caleb, gripped his hand tightly. "Did you speak with him directly?" Emmett asked. Gideon shook his head. "Thought it best to observe from a distance. He's staying at the hotel room facing the street. Dressed like a city man, good suit, bowler hat. Carries himself with confidence." "A Pinkerton, perhaps," Wesley suggested, his legal knowledge surfacing. "Possibly," Gideon agreed. "He has that look about him." Victoria felt a chill run through her. Pinkerton detectives were known for their thoroughness and determination. If Blackwood had hired one to find them, their situation was even more precarious than she'd feared. "What exactly is going on here?" Gideon asked, looking directly at the Hartford sisters. "Who is this man, and why is he looking for you?" Victoria glanced at her sisters, receiving small nods of permission. "It's a complicated situation," she began, then proceeded to explain about their father's conviction, Blackwood's manipulation, and their flight from Boston. She omitted certain details, Clara's witness to their father's death, the quilt's mysterious code, but provided enough information for the Sullivan brothers to understand the gravity of their circumstances. When she finished, silence hung in the room for several long moments. "So this Blackwood fellow," Caleb said. Finally, his youthful face creased with concern as he looked at Clara. "He's trying to control you all. Even though you're grown women." "He's trying to protect himself," Sophia corrected bitterly. "If we were to challenge the ownership of our father's patents to reveal the evidence of his fraud—" "What evidence?" Wesley asked, his legal mind immediately focusing on this point. Victoria hesitated, but Lillian spoke up. "We believe our mother may have hidden information in a family quilt, a code of some kind, that might lead to our father's private journals." "And these journals would prove Blackwood's guilt?" Emmett asked. Victoria nodded. "Father kept meticulous records of all his business dealings. If we could find the original journals, they would show that Blackwood falsified documents, forged signatures, systematically stole from the company. That's why we came west," Sophia added. "Not just to escape Blackwood's guardianship, but to give ourselves time to decipher the quilt and locate the evidence." Wesley looked thoughtful. "Even if you found this evidence, pursuing legal action from Montana Territory against a wealthy Boston businessman would be extremely difficult." "We're aware of the challenges," Victoria said, "but first we need to understand what the quilt is telling us." Emmett, who had been silent throughout much of the discussion, finally spoke. "This Pierce fellow, if he's working for Blackwood, what's his likely approach? Will he try to force you to return to Boston?" "Not directly," Victoria replied. "That would create too much attention. More likely he'll attempt to establish our location, then report back to Blackwood, who would then take more discreet measures," Gideon surmised grimly. An uncomfortable silence followed this assessment. "So what do we do?" Caleb asked, his arm protectively around Clara's shoulders. All eyes turned to Emmett, who seemed to carry the weight of the decision naturally. He studied each face in turn, his expression thoughtful. For now, we continue as normal, he said finally. The Hartford sisters remain here under our protection. Gideon will monitor Pierce's activities in town. Wesley helped Lillian with deciphering that quilt. Your education might prove useful there. He turned to Victoria. This ranch is your sanctuary for as long as you need it. The Sullivan family stands with you in this. The simple declaration, delivered without drama or excessive sentiment, nevertheless brought tears to Victoria's eyes. For so long, she had carried the responsibility of protecting her sisters alone. To have all allies in this fight, strong, capable allies who asked for nothing in return, was almost overwhelming. Thank you, she said softly, the words inadequate for the depth of her gratitude. Emmett nodded once, acknowledgement rather than dismissal, then rose to his feet. We should all get some rest. Tomorrow may bring challenges we're not expecting. As the group dispersed, Victoria noticed how the relationships had subtly shifted during the conversation. Caleb's arm remained around Clara, his protective instinct now given purpose. Wesley and Lillian moved toward the quilt, already discussing approaches to decoding its message. Gideon and Sophia stood close together, their usual verbal sparring replaced by a shared determination. And Emmett looked at Victoria with new understanding, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. Not just as a woman who had arrived unexpectedly on his doorstep, but as someone whose burdens mirrored his own responsibility, duty, the weight of others' welfare. Later that night, as Victoria prepared for bed, a soft knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find Emmett standing in the hallway, his tall frame silhouetted against the dim light of the oil lamp behind him. "May I speak with you a moment?" he asked, his voice low, to avoid disturbing the others. Victoria stepped into the hallway, pulling her wrapper more tightly around her. "Of course. I've been thinking about your situation." Emmett began, his gaze direct. "And I believe there's something you're still not telling me." Victoria stiffened slightly. "Mr. Sullivan." "Emmett, please." His interruption was gentle but firm. "If we're to face this together, we should at least use each other's names." The concession was small but significant, and Victoria nodded her acceptance. "Emmett, then, what makes you think I'm withholding information?" "Experience," he replied simply. "I've seen enough of the world to recognize when someone is carrying a heavier burden than they admit to." Victoria hesitated, torn between the habit of secrecy and the growing trust she felt toward this man. "There are aspects of our situation that I've chosen not to share, yes, not out of distrust, but out of protection. For your sisters, for everyone involved." Victoria sighed, suddenly weary of half-truths. "The less you know about certain details, the safer you and your brothers will be if Blackwood's agent discovers us here." Emmett's scarred face softened slightly. "Victoria, my family has already committed to standing with yours. Holding back information now doesn't protect us, it potentially leaves us vulnerable to surprises." He was right, of course. Victoria had been so accustomed to carrying her burdens alone that sharing them now felt almost impossible. But the events of the day had made it clear that isolation was no longer a viable strategy. "Clara was there the night our father died," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "She saw everything." Emmett's expression remained steady, though his eyes sharpened with understanding. "She witnessed something that contradicts the official account of his death." Victoria nodded, glancing toward her bedroom door, where Clara lay sleeping. "Our father didn't die in prison, as I told you. He died at home before his arrest. Clara saw Blackwood push him down the stairs during an argument. She tried to scream, but no one heard her over a thunderstorm. And she hasn't spoken since." Emmett concluded, the pieces finally falling into place. "Not a word," Victoria confirmed. "The trauma of that night silenced her completely. And Blackwood knows she was there. He saw her door close. If he ever found her, he'd eliminate the only witness to his crime," Emmett finished grimly. Victoria nodded, relieved that he understood without requiring further explanation. "Now you see why we had to flee, why we can never return to Boston. And why this quilt is so important," Emmett added. "If it leads to evidence of Blackwood's financial crimes, it might provide you leverage even without Clara's testimony." "Exactly." Victoria was impressed by his quick grasp of their situation. "But first we have to decipher what my mother sewed into it, and we're not even certain what we're looking for." Emmett was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Tomorrow I'll help Wesley and Lillian with the quilt. Another perspective might be useful." The offer was unexpected but welcome. Thank you for everything. In the dim light of the hallway, Emmett's scar seemed less pronounced, his features softened by shadow. For a brief moment, Victoria allowed herself to see him not as a reluctant host or potential protector, but simply as a man solid, steady, unexpectedly kind beneath his reserved exterior. "We should rest," he said, finally breaking the moment. "Morning comes early." Victoria nodded, suddenly aware of their proximity in the narrow hallway, of the impropriety of their conversation at this hour. "Good night, Emmett." "Good night, Victoria." He turned to go, then paused. "We'll figure this out. Together." The simple promise carried more weight than elaborate declarations might have. As Victoria returned to her room where Clara slept peacefully for the first time in months, she felt something she hadn't experienced since before her father's death. The next morning brought an unexpected development. Gideon returned from an early ride into town with news that Pierce had departed on the morning stage. Left without warning, he reported as the family gathered for breakfast, paid his bill at the hotel, and was gone before sunrise. "That seems abrupt," Wesley observed, exchanging glances with Emmett. Victoria felt unease rather than relief. He may have learned what he came to discover. "Which is what exactly?" Sophia asked. "Our location," Victoria replied grimly. "If he's returning to Boston to report to Blackwood, then we have some time," Emmett finished. "The journey east takes weeks. We should use that time wisely." After breakfast, Wesley, Lillian, and Emmett gathered in the parlor to examine the quilt. They spread it across the large table, studying the tiny stitches that Lillian had identified as a potential code. "They're definitely deliberate," Wesley confirmed, his scholarly background evident in his methodical approach. "See how they're grouped in patterns, numbers followed by letters, then more numbers." "Could they be page numbers?" Emmett suggested. "References to a book or document?" Lillian's eyes widened. "That would make sense. Father always kept detailed journals of his work. Mother would have known about them." As they worked to decipher the stitches, Victoria divided her attention between household tasks and the increasingly animated discussion in the parlor. By midday, Wesley had developed a theory. "I believe these are references to your father's journals," he explained, pointing to the sequences they'd identified. "Page numbers, paragraph numbers, perhaps even specific words or phrases." "But the journals themselves were seized when father was arrested," Victoria pointed out. "The official ones, yes," Lillian said slowly, realization dawning. "But mother once mentioned that father kept duplicate records, insurance, she called it. What if these stitches are directing us to those hidden copies?" "But where would they be?" Sophia asked, having joined the discussion. "We searched the house thoroughly before leaving Boston." Clara, who had been silently observing, suddenly took her slate from Caleb and wrote something, holding it up for everyone to see. "The cottage." Victoria stared at her youngest sister. "Father's fishing cottage on Lake Champlain, but that was sold years ago after mother died." Clara shook her head vigorously and wrote again, "Secret place beneath floorboards. Father showed me once." "A hiding place," Gideon said, understanding immediately. "Somewhere Blackwood wouldn't think to look." Victoria felt a surge of hope, quickly tempered by practicality. Even if the journals are there, the cottage now belongs to someone else, and it's thousands of miles away. "We could write to someone in the area," Wesley suggested. "Request that they check the location discreetly." "Too risky," Emmett countered. "If Blackwood has people watching your former properties or connections?" The group fell silent, contemplating this obstacle. Then Gideon straightened, a familiar gleam in his eye, the look he'd worn at poker tables across the West. "What if we turn the tables on Blackwood?" he proposed. "Instead of hiding from him, what if we made him think we have the journals already?" "How would that help?" Sophia asked skeptically. "It would change the dynamic," Gideon explained, warming to his idea. "Right now, he's hunting you. But if he believed you possessed evidence that could destroy him, he'd be the one on the defensive," Wesley concluded, nodding slowly. "Legally speaking, it creates leverage." Victoria considered the strategy. "It's risky. If he calls our bluff, then we're no worse off than we are now," Emmett said, his voice steady. "But if it works, it buys us time to figure out how to retrieve the actual journals." Before they could discuss further, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Emmett moved to the window, his posture immediately tensing. "Riders coming," he said, his voice deliberately calm. "4 of them. One appears to be Sheriff Wheeler." Victoria exchanged alarmed glances with her sisters. Why would the sheriff be coming here? We're about to find out, Emmett replied grimly. Gideon, get the rifles, just in case. As Gideon moved swiftly to comply, Emmett turned to the Hartford sisters. Stay inside, let us handle this. Victoria wanted to protest but recognized the wisdom in his directive. The Sullivan brothers were established members of the community. Their word would carry more weight with the local sheriff than that of newly arrived women. Through the window, she watched as Emmett, Gideon, and Wesley stepped onto the porch to meet the approaching riders. Caleb remained inside, positioning himself protectively near Clara. The sheriff was a heavy-set man with a florid face and small, shrewd eyes. He dismounted with surprising agility for his bulk, followed by 3 deputies. Sullivan, he greeted Emmett, his tone neutral but his stance aggressive. Got some questions about your guests. The Hartford sisters are staying with us while we determine if there's a match to be made, Emmett replied evenly. Is there a problem, Sheriff? Wheeler's gaze flicked toward the house. Had a visitor in town, respectable fellow from back east. Says these women might be running from legal troubles. Victoria's heart pounded as she listened, her fingers gripping the windowsill tightly. What kind of legal troubles? Emmett asked, his voice betraying nothing. Didn't specify, Wheeler admitted. But he seemed mighty concerned about finding them. And did you inform this respectable fellow of their whereabouts? Gideon inquired, his casual tone at odds with the tension visible in his shoulders. Wheeler shifted uncomfortably. Might have mentioned they were staying out at Sullivan Ranch. Public knowledge, after all. Victoria closed her eyes briefly. So Pierce had succeeded in confirming their location before departing. The clock was now ticking even faster than they'd feared. Outside, Emmett's expression remained impassive, but his voice hardened slightly. Next time a stranger comes asking questions about my family or guests, Sheriff, I'd appreciate the courtesy of being informed before you share information. Your family, Wheeler repeated, his eyebrows rising. These women are just visitors, Sullivan, unless there's been a development I'm not aware of. A tense silence followed, during which Victoria held her breath. Then Emmett spoke, his voice carrying clearly through the open window. The Hartford sisters are under the protection of the Sullivan family, he stated firmly. Their welfare is our concern. Is that clear enough for you, Sheriff? Wheeler studied Emmett's face, seeming to weigh his options. Finally, he nodded curtly. Clear enough. But if there's trouble brewing, I want to know about it. This is a peaceful county, and I aim to keep it that way. There won't be any trouble from us, Emmett assured him. Though the implicit warning was clear, any threat to the Hartford sisters would be met with Sullivan resistance. After a few more terse exchanges, the sheriff and his deputies remounted and rode away. Victoria watched them go, relief mingling with renewed anxiety. Pierce knew where they were and presumably would soon report this information to Blackwood. Their sanctuary had been compromised. When the Sullivan brothers returned inside, the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken concern. So now we know, Gideon said, breaking the silence. Pierce found what he came for. And informed the local law about potential legal troubles, Wesley added grimly, setting the groundwork for Blackwood's next move. Victoria looked at her sisters, seeing her own worry reflected in their faces. We should leave, she said quietly. We brought danger to your home, and we can't. No, Emmett interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. Running now would only make you more vulnerable. The safest place for you is here with us. But Blackwood, Victoria began. Will have to come through us to get to you, Emmett stated simply. He looked around at his brothers, receiving nods of agreement from each. This is no longer just your fight, Victoria. It's ours too. The declaration, made without flourish or grandstanding, nevertheless carried immense weight. The Sullivan brothers had committed themselves to protecting the Hartford sisters, not out of obligation or expectation, but out of a growing bond that transcended their unusual beginning. Victoria felt something shift within her, a loosening of the tight control she'd maintained since her father's death, a willingness to share the burden she'd carried alone for so long. Thank you, she said softly, the words encompassing far more than simple gratitude. Emmett held her gaze for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then he turned to address the group. We need a plan, not just defensive measures, but a way to resolve this situation permanently. Gideon's suggestion has merit, Wesley offered. If we could convince Blackwood that we already possess evidence against him. We'd need something convincing, Sophia pointed out. something he would believe without question. Clara had been writing on her slate, and now she held it up father's ledger. The green one with the leather binding. Victoria looked at her sister with surprise. You remember that? Clara nodded emphatically, writing again. He always carried it. Blackwood wanted it the night. She paused, her hand trembling slightly, then continued. The night he pushed father. A ledger containing evidence of Blackwood's crimes, Gideon mused. That would certainly be persuasive. But we don't have it, Lillian reminded them. Blackwood doesn't know that Emmett said understanding Gideon's strategy. If he believes you have it, or even a copy of it, hidden somewhere as insurance, he might be willing to negotiate, Wesley concluded, or at least hesitate before taking direct action against you. Victoria considered the possibility. It was a gamble, certainly, but perhaps their best option given the circumstances. How would we convince him he's not a man easily deceived? Gideon's expression grew thoughtful. We need a messenger. Someone Blackwood would believe, but who isn't directly connected to either of you. Pierce, Emmett suggested after a moment, the detective he hired. But Pierce works for Blackwood, Sophia objected. Pinkerton detectives work for whoever pays them, Gideon corrected. Their loyalty is to facts, not individuals. If we could convince Pierce that you have evidence against Blackwood, Wesley elaborated, he might report that information back to his employer, especially if it affects the case he was hired to investigate. The plan began to take shape, create a convincing piece of evidence, not the ledger itself, but something that suggested its existence and contents, and ensure Pierce saw it before he returned to Boston. As the discussion continued, Victoria found herself watching Emmett. He participated actively, his suggestions practical and thoughtful, but she sensed a deeper concern beneath his calm exterior. When the group briefly dispersed to gather materials for their deception, she approached him privately. You're worried, she observed quietly. Emmett met her gaze directly. This plan may buy us time, but it doesn't solve the fundamental problem. Blackwood is still a threat and will remain so as long as he believes Clara can testify against him. You think he'll come himself? Victoria realized the thought chilling her. Eventually, yes. Emmett's expression was grim. Men like Blackwood don't trust others to handle their most crucial problems. Victoria had feared the same, though she hadn't voiced it aloud. And when he does, Emmett's scarred face hardened with resolve. Then he'll find that the Hartford sisters aren't alone anymore. The simple statement carried more comfort than elaborate promises might have. Victoria had spent so long protecting her sisters, fighting battles alone, that the prospect of having allies, of having Emmett standing beside them, was almost overwhelming. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his arm, a gesture of gratitude, and something more, a recognition of the connection that had formed between them, unexpected, but increasingly undeniable. Emmett looked down at her hand, then back to her face. For a brief moment, his stoic expression softened, revealing the man beneath the responsibility, a man capable of tenderness as well as strength. The moment was interrupted by Gideon's return, but it lingered in Victoria's mind as they rejoined the others to finalize their plan. Whatever happened in the days ahead, she was no longer facing it alone. And somehow that knowledge made even the prospect of confronting Cornelius Blackwood seem less daunting. Outside, the Montana afternoons stretched toward evening, the vast landscape indifferent to the human dramas unfolding beneath its expansive sky. But within the walls of Sullivan Ranch, a new alliance had formed, one that would soon be tested in ways none of them could fully anticipate. The plan came together with surprising speed. Using information Clara provided about her father's ledger, its distinctive green leather binding, the Hartford Company emblem embossed on the cover, Lillian created a convincing replica. Inside, she carefully transcribed selections from the quilt's encoded messages, arranging them to suggest financial records that implicated Blackwood in fraud. It won't withstand close scrutiny, Wesley cautioned as they examined the finished product. But it doesn't need to. It only needs to plant doubt in Pierce's mind. And how exactly do we ensure he sees it? Sophia asked, ever practical. Gideon's expression brightened with the familiar gleam that appeared whenever he contemplated a calculated risk. Leave that to me. Our detective friend may have left town, but the stagecoach route east passes through Junction City. He'll stop there overnight before continuing. Junction City is a full day's ride from here, Emmett pointed out. Then I'd best get started, Gideon replied, already moving toward the door. Sophia, care to join me? Two travelers attract less attention than one, and your sharp eye would be valuable. Sophia looked surprised at the invitation, then thoughtful. Yes, she decided after a moment. I'll accompany you. Victoria watched this exchange with interest. Despite their constant verbal sparring, Gideon and Sophia had developed a rapport built on mutual respect and perhaps something more. The thought brought a mixture of hope and concern. Their situation remained precarious, hardly conducive to romantic attachments. Yet as her gaze drifted to where Lillian and Wesley bent their heads together over the false ledger, and to Caleb teaching Clara a new hand signal by the window, Victoria couldn't deny that connections had formed. The Hartford sisters and Sullivan brothers, thrown together by circumstance, had become something more than reluctant hosts and desperate guests. They'll be all right, Emmett said quietly, appearing beside her, as if sensing her thoughts. Gideon may seem reckless, but he's smarter than most give him credit for. And your sister strikes me as someone who can handle herself in difficult situations. She learned to shoot during the war, Victoria confided, worked as a nurse in a field hospital, and convinced a sergeant to teach her. Said she'd never be defenseless again. Emmett's eyebrows rose slightly. Then perhaps I should be more concerned for Pierce than for them. The small joke, unexpected from the usually serious Emmett, drew a genuine smile from Victoria. Perhaps you should. As Gideon and Sophia prepared for their journey, Victoria helped pack provisions, slipping a small derringer into Sophia's bag when no one was looking. Her sister noticed, of course, nodded once in acknowledgement, but said nothing. Some precautions required no explanation between them. Be careful, Victoria murmured as they embraced before Sophia's departure. This is just reconnaissance. No heroics. I could say the same to you, Sophia returned quietly. Don't do anything rash while I'm gone. Victoria thought of the growing tension at the ranch, the sheriff's suspicious visit, the constant awareness that their sanctuary might be compromised at any moment. I'll do my best. After Gideon and Sophia rode out, a strange quiet settled over the ranch. Their absence left a gap in the household dynamic. Gideon's easy charm and Sophia's sharp retorts had provided a counterpoint to the others' more reserved natures. The day passed slowly, each hour stretching with the weight of anticipation. Wesley and Lillian continued working on the quilt's code, making progress in small increments. Caleb took Clara for a riding lesson, their absence from the tense atmosphere a relief to Victoria. And Emmett seemed everywhere and nowhere, attending to ranch duties, but always within sight of the house, his vigilance a constant reminder of the danger they faced. By evening, Victoria's nerves were stretched thin with waiting. She found herself on the porch after dinner, seeking fresh air and a moment's solitude. The sunset painted the Montana sky in dramatic strokes of orange and purple, the vastness of it still astonishing to her eastern sensibilities. The screen door creaked behind her, and she knew without turning that it was Emmett. His footsteps had become familiar to her over the past weeks, deliberate, measured like the man himself. Beautiful, isn't it? He said, coming to stand beside her at the railing. It makes Boston seem very small, Victoria admitted. All those buildings and streets, the constant noise and bustle. Out here, everything is expansive. Too expansive for some, Emmett observed. Many who come west return east within a year. The space overwhelms them. Victoria considered this. And for you, did it ever feel too vast? No. His answer came without hesitation. Even during the war, with men packed so closely you could smell their fear, I longed for open skies. He paused, his profile strong against the fading light. Perhaps that's why I survived when others didn't. I had somewhere to return to that made sense to me. It was the most he'd spoken about his wartime experiences, and Victoria received the confidence with appropriate gravity. Your friend Jesse, she said softly, the one you mentioned before. He didn't have that anchor. Emmett's hand moved unconsciously to his scar, tracing its familiar path. Jesse was from Philadelphia, city born and bred. He joined up for adventure, for glory. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Used to say he'd write a book about it all when we got home. The Adventures of Jesse Harmon and Emmett Sullivan. Had the title all picked out. What happened to him? Victoria asked gently. Emmett's expression closed like a door shutting. Shiloh happened. The same shell that gave me this. He gestured to his scar. Took Jesse's life. He was standing right beside me. Should have been me. The guilt in his voice was unmistakable, a weight he'd carried for years. Victoria understood it all too well, the burden of survival when others perished, the constant questioning of why fate had spared you and not them. My father used to say that asking why about tragedy is like trying to count the stars, she offered quietly. You can never finish, and the attempt might drive you mad. Emmett glanced at her, surprise and something like recognition in his eyes. Your father sounds like he was a wise man. He was, Victoria agreed, her throat tightening with familiar grief. Not perfect, he could be stubborn and distracted, lost in his inventions for days at a time, but wise about the things that mattered. They stood in companionable silence as the last rays of sunlight disappeared and the first stars emerged in the darkening sky. Victoria was acutely aware of Emmett's presence beside her, solid, steady, unexpectedly comforting. Do you think Gideon and Sophia will succeed? She asked, finally voicing the concern that had been foremost in her mind all day. If anyone can convince Pierce to question his employer's motives, it's Gideon, Emmett replied. He has a gift for making people see things his way, and your sister seems equally persuasive, albeit with a different approach. Victoria smiled slightly at this diplomatic assessment of Sophia's forthright nature. They make a rather formidable team, don't they? As do we all, Emmett said, his tone suggesting the observation applied to more than just Gideon and Sophia. Before Victoria could respond, the sound of approaching horses caught their attention. Both tensed, alert to potential danger, but it was only Caleb and Clara returning from their ride. They dismounted in the yard, Caleb helping Clara down with careful courtesy. In the fading light, Victoria could see her youngest sister's face glowing with an animation that had been absent for months. Clara's hands moved in the private sign language she and Caleb had developed, and the young man laughed in response. They've created their own world, Victoria murmured, moved by the sight. Caleb has always been good at finding ways around obstacles, Emmett said, watching the pair with undisguised affection. When we first found him during the war, orphaned, half-starved, he couldn't speak English, only Polish from his parents. But within months, you'd never have known he wasn't born here. Victoria looked at him with surprise. I didn't realize Caleb wasn't your blood relation. Emmett shook his head. Does it matter? He's been my brother in every way that counts since he was 12 years old. The simple declaration touched Victoria deeply. The Sullivans understood family bonds that transcended convention or blood, a perspective that resonated with her own fierce protection of her sisters. No, she agreed softly, it doesn't matter at all. As Caleb and Clara approached the house, Victoria noted how they moved in unconscious synchronicity, already attuned to each other's rhythms. It reminded her of the way she sometimes found herself matching Emmett's stride when they walked together, or anticipating his thoughts before he voiced them. Such awareness usually took years to develop. That it had formed so quickly between them all suggested something Victoria had been reluctant to acknowledge. The Hartford sisters and Sullivan brothers fit together in ways that seemed almost destined, as if the pattern had existed before they even met. The thought both comforted and unsettled her. Their future remained uncertain, shadowed by Blackwood's threat. To form attachments now to allow hope to take root felt dangerous, a vulnerability they could ill afford. Yet watching Clara's animated expressions as she and Caleb joined them on the porch, Victoria couldn't bring herself to regret the connections that had formed. Whatever came next, these bonds had already changed them all. Gideon and Sophia returned 2 days later, dust-covered and weary, but triumphant. Mission accomplished, Gideon announced as they gathered around the kitchen table. Pierce took the bait like a hungry trout. What happened exactly? Wesley asked, ever attentive to details. Sophia took up the narrative, her usual reserve softened by the satisfaction of success. We arrived in Junction City ahead of the eastbound stage. Gideon established himself at the hotel bar. My natural habitat, Gideon interjected with a grin. While I secured a room with a view of the street, Sophia continued, ignoring the interruption. When Pierce arrived, Gideon engineered a chance encounter. Bumped into him, spilled his drink, insisted on buying him another. Gideon elaborated. The usual opening gambit. And he didn't recognize you from Promise Creek? Emmett asked with a frown. I was careful to keep my distance there, Gideon assured him. And a change of clothes, a different hat. It's remarkable how such simple alterations can change a man's appearance. Victoria could well believe it. Gideon had a chameleon-like quality, his personality shifting subtly to match his surroundings. It was what had made him a successful gambler, and now perhaps what would save them all. Once the conversation was established, Sophia continued, Gideon mentioned he'd recently purchased some interesting documents from a group of women traveling west. Showed Pierce a page accidentally, just enough to see the Hartford Company letterhead and some suggestive financial notations. His reaction, Victoria asked, hardly daring to hope. Immediate interest, Gideon confirmed. Tried to hide it, of course, but I've made my living reading men's faces. He recognized what he was seeing, and it concerned him deeply. Did he try to purchase the documents from you? Wesley inquired. Gideon shook his head. I played the ignorant buyer, claimed I'd acquired them as curiosities, part of a larger lot of papers. Said I'd left them with a lawyer in Promise Creek for safekeeping. Which plants the idea that evidence exists without directly connecting it to us. Victoria realized, appreciating the strategy's elegance. Precise, Law, Sophia agreed. Pierce asked several questions trying to determine where we'd encountered these women, but we kept the details vague, just enough to suggest they might be the Hartford sisters without confirming it. And then we parted ways, Gideon concluded. Pierce boarding the eastbound stage the next morning, looking considerably more thoughtful than when he'd arrived. Emmett nodded slowly, processing the information. So now we wait, see how Blackwood responds when Pierce reports back. Which gives us time to further decipher the quilt. Lillian added, her expression brightening. Wesley and I have made significant progress. We believe we've identified not just references to Father's ledger, but specific locations where evidence might be hidden. Beyond the fishing cottage Clara mentioned, Victoria asked with surprise. Lillian nodded. Mother was thorough. She created redundancies, multiple hiding places, each containing pieces of the whole. Clara, who had been listening intently, wrote on her slate, Father always said, never keep all your eggs in one basket. Wise advice, Emmett commented, especially when dealing with someone like Blackwood. The conversation continued, strategies refined and contingencies planned. But underlying the practical discussion was a current of something Victoria hadn't allowed herself to feel in months: optimism. For the first time since their father's death, they weren't simply reacting to Blackwood's moves, but shaping the contest themselves. Later that evening, Victoria found herself alone with Emmett in his study, a small room off the main parlor that served as the ranch's administrative center. Maps covered one wall, while shelves of ledgers and agricultural journals lined another. It was a practical space like the man himself, but not without character. Gideon and Sophia did well, Emmett said, pouring a small measure of whiskey into 2 glasses and offering one to Victoria. Better than I'd hoped. Victoria accepted the glass, though she rarely indulged. The occasion seemed to warrant it. They worked surprisingly well together for 2 people who argue constantly. A hint of amusement crossed Emmett's face. Some might say the same about us. The observation startled a laugh from Victoria. Do we argue that much? Perhaps not aloud, Emmett conceded, his eyes warming with unexpected humor. But I can practically hear your thoughts when you disagree with me. A dangerous talent, Mr. Sullivan, Victoria replied, matching his lighter tone. What am I thinking now? Emmett studied her face, his gaze unexpectedly intent. That you're allowing yourself to hope, and it frightens you. The accuracy of his assessment stole Victoria's breath. She looked away, taking a sip of whiskey to cover her discomfort. Hope is a luxury I haven't been able to afford for some time. Not a luxury, Emmett corrected gently. A necessity. Without it, what are we fighting for? Victoria considered this, turning the glass in her hands. For survival, for justice, for my sister's future. All worthy causes, Emmett agreed, but perhaps there's room for more. His gaze held hers, and Victoria found herself unable to look away. In the lamplight, Emmett's features seemed softer, the scar less pronounced. Or perhaps it was simply that she no longer saw it as a disfigurement, but as an integral part of him, a badge of survival that spoke to his strength. What more did you have in mind? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Emmett set down his glass and moved closer, close enough that Victoria could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. A future that isn't defined by what we're running from, but by what we're running toward. He reached out slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, and took her hand in his. The touch was gentle but firm, like the man himself. Victoria, he began, his deep voice uncommonly soft. When you arrived, I was resistant to the idea of you. Not because of any fault in you, but because I'd convinced myself I had no right to such happiness. Victoria's heart quickened, but she remained silent, sensing he needed to continue without interruption. I was wrong, Emmett said simply. These past weeks have shown me that. Whatever happens with Blackwood, whatever challenges we face, I want you to know that you and your sisters have a place here. Not as guests or dependents, but as equals, as family. The declaration, unembellished but profound, moved Victoria deeply. For so long, she had carried the weight of responsibility alone, been the strong one, the decision maker. To hear someone like Emmett offer to share that burden, not out of pity, but out of respect and genuine caring, was almost overwhelming. I don't know what to say, she admitted uncharacteristically, at a loss for words. You don't need to say anything now, Emmett assured her, his thumb brushing lightly across her knuckles. Just know that whatever comes, you are not facing it alone anymore. Victoria looked at their joined hands, his large and work-roughened, hers smaller, but equally marked by life's hardships. Different paths, different struggles, yet somehow aligned in this moment. Thank you, she said finally, the simple words carrying the weight of emotions too complex to express. For everything. Emmett nodded, once understanding in his eyes. Then, with a gentleness that belied his size and strength, he raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her fingers, a gesture both old-fashioned and profoundly moving. The moment held suspended in the warm lamplight, a fragile bubble of possibility in a world still fraught with danger. Neither spoke further, but something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing steadily beneath the surface of their practical alliance. When Victoria finally returned to her room that night, she found herself standing at the window, gazing at the star-filled Montana sky. For the first time and longer than she could remember, she allowed herself to imagine a future beyond survival, a future where Sullivan Ranch was not a temporary haven, but a permanent home where the bonds formed in crisis could strengthen and flourish in peace. It was a dangerous indulgence, perhaps. Blackwood remained a threat, his response to Pierce's report yet unknown. But as Emmett had said, hope wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. Without it, what were they fighting for? With that thought warming her heart, Victoria finally slept her dreams for once, unmarred by shadows of the past. The respite proved short-lived. 3 weeks after Gideon and Sophia's successful mission to Junction City, Sheriff Wheeler returned to Sullivan Ranch, this time alone, and bearing news that sent a chill through the household. Thought you should know, he said gruffly, declining Emmett's offer to come inside. Got a telegram from back east. Some businessman named Blackwood arriving next week. Says he has legal business concerning 4 women staying at your ranch. Victoria Lessuishing from just inside the doorway felt her blood run cold. Blackwood himself coming to Montana. Their worst fears realized. What kind of legal business? Emmett asked, his voice carefully neutral. Wheeler shrugged. I didn't specify, but he's bringing documentation, he says, and he's hired 3 men to accompany him. 3 armed men, I presume, Emmett said, more statement than question. Didn't mention that specifically, Wheeler replied, though his expression suggested he'd drawn the same conclusion. Just thought you should be prepared. This Blackwood fellow sounds important, mentioned connections to the Governor Eastern Banks, that sort of thing. Thank you for the warning, Sheriff, Emmett said, his tone making it clear the conversation was concluded. Wheeler hesitated, then leaned closer. Sullivan, I don't know what's going on here, and I don't much care, but I don't like Eastern types coming into my county throwing their weight around. You need anything, you let me know. The offer surprised both Emmett and Victoria. Wheeler had seemed firmly in Blackwood's camp during his previous visit. I appreciate that, Sheriff, Emmett replied with genuine gratitude. As Wheeler rode away, Emmett turned to find Victoria standing in the doorway, her face pale but composed. You heard, he asked unnecessarily. She nodded. He's coming himself, just as you predicted. With hired guns, Emmett added grimly, following her inside where the others had gathered, alerted by Wheeler's arrival. Victoria looked around at her sisters' faces, Sophia's determined, Lillian's anxious, Clara's frightened, and made a swift decision. We need to leave, tonight. No, Emmett's voice was firm but not unkind. Running now would only postpone the inevitable. Blackwood would track you down again, and the next time you might not have allies nearby. Emmett's right, Wesley agreed, his legal mind assessing the situation. Besides, fleeing would make you appear guilty in the eyes of the law, give credence to whatever claims Blackwood brings against you. Then what do you suggest? Sophia demanded, her fear manifesting as anger. We simply wait for him to arrive with his hired thugs and take us back to Boston. No, Gideon interjected, his expression unusually serious. We prepare. We use the time we have to strengthen our position. A strategy session followed. The group gathered around the dining table like generals planning a campaign. Wesley's legal knowledge, Gideon's tactical thinking, Emmett's practical leadership all combined with the Hartford sisters' intimate understanding of their adversary to create a comprehensive defense. First, Wesley began, we need to understand exactly what legal claims Blackwood might bring. The guardianship petition for Clara is the most obvious. But she's living with adult sisters, Lillian objected. Surely that's sufficient supervision. Normally, yes, Wesley agreed. But if Blackwood can argue that Victoria and Sophia are unsuitable guardians, perhaps citing your flight from Boston as evidence of instability, he might prevail. There's also the matter of your father's estate, Emmett added. If Blackwood controls that as executor or creditor, he could use financial pressure. Victoria nodded grimly. He's likely to bring both approaches, legal and financial. And when those fail, he'll resort to more direct methods. The hired guns, Caleb said quietly, his arm protective around Clara's shoulders. Which means we need our own protection, Gideon stated matter-of-factly. The ranch hands who have been helping with the North Pasture, Matt and Elijah, their former cavalry. Good men in a fight. I'll ride out tomorrow, see if they'll stay on. And I'll speak with Sheriff Wheeler again. Emmett decided. His offer of assistance seemed genuine. Having the law on our side, even partially, would be advantageous. What about the quilt? Lillian asked. Wesley and I have made progress, but we still don't have the complete picture. If we had the actual evidence from Father's hidden journals, too late for that, Victoria said regretfully. Even if we knew exactly where to look, Boston is thousands of miles away. Blackwood will be here in a week. Clara, who had been silent throughout the discussion, suddenly wrote on her slate, Mr. Jenkins. Victoria looked at her sister with confusion. Father's solicitor, what about him? Clara wrote rapidly. Father trusted him, told him where journals were hidden. Clara, are you certain, Mom? Sophia pressed, leaning forward intently. Father never mentioned this to any of us. Clara nodded emphatically, adding to her note, heard them talking. Just before, she didn't need to finish the sentence. Just before their father's death. Just before Clara's witness of it had stolen her voice. Even if that's true, Victoria said gently, Mr. Jenkins is in Boston. We have no way to contact him without alerting Blackwood. Perhaps we do, Wesley suggested, his scholarly mind working through the problem. Telegraph offices maintain confidentiality. If we can get word to Mr. Jenkins, discreetly ask him to send the journals, or at least confirm their contents. It's worth trying, Emmett agreed. I'll ride into Promise Creek first thing tomorrow, send the telegram myself. As the planning continued, Victoria found herself drawing strength from the collective determination surrounding her. These people, the Sullivan brothers, who had welcomed them, her sisters who had endured so much, were unified in purpose, despite the danger ahead. Late that night, as the household finally settled into uneasy sleep, Victoria found herself unable to rest. She slipped downstairs, careful not to wake Clara, and made her way to the porch. The night air was cool, scented with pine and sage, the vast Montana sky ablaze with stars. She wasn't entirely surprised when Emmett joined her a few minutes later, as if some invisible thread connected them, alerting him to her presence. You should be resting, he said quietly, coming to stand beside her at the railing. So should you, Victoria returned with a faint smile. Yet here we are. They stood in companionable silence for a time, the familiar comfort of each other's presence requiring no words. Finally, Victoria voiced the concern that had been growing in her mind. What if we can't stop him? Emmett, what if Blackwood takes my sisters back to Boston? What if he... She couldn't finish the sentence, the possibilities too terrible to articulate. Emmett turned to face her, his expression resolute in the moonlight. That won't happen. You can't promise that, Victoria whispered. Not against a man like Blackwood. I can, Emmett insisted, his voice low but fervent. And I do, whatever it takes, Victoria, whatever it takes, I will not let him harm you or your sisters. The vehemence of his declaration caught her off guard. This wasn't merely the promise of a host to his guests, or even of a friend to those he cared for. This was something deeper, more primal, a man's vow to protect those he considered his own. Victoria studied his face, the strong lines and planes she had come to know so well over these weeks. The scar that had once seemed intimidating now spoke only of courage and survival. The eyes that had first appeared remote now revealed depths of feeling that took her breath away. "Why?" she asked softly, needing to hear him say it. Emmett's gaze held hers steadily. "Because in you I found something I never expected to find again after the war. Purpose. Hope." He paused, then added simply, "Home." The word hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond its simple syllable. Home, not a place but a feeling, a belonging. Met, Victoria began, her usual composure wavering under the intensity of emotion. He stepped closer, one hand rising to gently cup her cheek. "You don't have to tea anything. Just know that whatever happens in the days ahead, my heart is decided. It has been from the moment you stepped off that stagecoach, though I was too stubborn to recognize it then." Victoria leaned into his touch, allowing herself this moment of vulnerability, of connection. "And mine as well," she admitted quietly. "Despite everything, the danger, the uncertainty, I can't regret coming here. Finding you." The confession seemed to release something in Emmett, slowly giving her every opportunity to withdraw. He lowered his head and kissed her, a gentle, questioning touch that deepened as Victoria responded, her hands coming up to rest against his chest. It was a kiss born of shared struggle and mutual respect, of growing affection tempered by adversity. Not a dramatic passion, but something steadier and more enduring, a promise of partnership that transcended their current circumstances. When they finally parted, Emmett kept her close, his forehead resting against hers. "Whatever comes," he murmured, "we face it together." Victoria nodded, too moved for words. In that moment, despite the looming threat of Blackwood's arrival, she felt a certainty that had eluded her since her father's death. Whatever happened, she was no longer alone. No longer solely responsible for her sister's welfare. She had found not just allies, but family in the Sullivan brothers, and in Emmett, something even more precious. With that knowledge warming her heart, she finally allowed Emmett to escort her back inside their hands, remaining joined as they ascended the stairs and reluctantly parted at her bedroom door. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, preparations for Blackwood's arrival, the desperate attempt to contact Mr. Jenkins in Boston. But tonight, Victoria had found something she'd believed lost forever: peace. The week that followed was a blur of activity. Emmett sent the telegram to Mr. Jenkins, carefully worded to avoid drawing attention, yet clear enough to convey the urgency of their situation. Gideon convinced Matt and Elijah to stay on at the ranch, discreetly reinforcing their defenses. Wesley and Lillian continued deciphering the quilt's code, making incremental progress that might prove crucial. Sheriff Wheeler visited again, this time bringing news that Blackwood had telegraphed ahead to reserve rooms at the Promise Creek Hotel for himself and his associates. 4 rooms, Wheeler reported, paid for a week in advance. Whatever he's planning, he's not expecting it to resolve quickly. Or he's making a show of confidence. Emmett suggested, his expression thoughtful. Trying to intimidate us before he even arrives. "Well, it won't work," Gideon declared firmly. "The Sullivan family doesn't intimidate easily." Victoria noted his phrasing, "the Sullivan family, not the Sullivan brothers." The distinction was subtle but significant, implying that the Hartford sisters were now included in that protective circle. 3 days before Blackwood's expected arrival, a response came from Mr. Jenkins. The telegram was brief but electrifying. "Received your message. Stop. Documents secure. Stop. Copies sent to Territorial Judge Lawrence, Promise Creek. Stop. Arrive same train as inquiring party. Stop. Jenkins." "He's coming himself," Victoria breathed, hardly daring to believe their fortune. "And he's bringing evidence." "And sending copies directly to the local judge," Wesley added, clearly impressed by the solicitor's thoroughness. "This changes everything." Indeed, the telegram transformed their defensive strategy into something more proactive. If Mr. Jenkins had preserved Abraham Hartford's journals, as Clara remembered, and if those journals contained the evidence they believed they did, Blackwood's arrival might not signal their defeat but his own. "We still need to be cautious," Emmett warned, tempering their rising optimism. "Blackwood won't surrender easily, especially not with hired guns at his disposal. And we don't know exactly what evidence Jenkins is bringing." "Agreed," Victoria said, her practical nature reasserting itself. We continue preparations as planned, but this gives us hope that Blackwood can be defeated legally, not just delayed. The final days before Blackwood's arrival passed intense anticipation. The ranch was as prepared as they could make it, defenses subtle but effective allies, alerted strategies in place. Yet Victoria could feel the strain wearing on them all, particularly Clara, whose nightmares had returned with increasing frequency. On the eve of Blackwood's expected arrival, Victoria found her youngest sister sitting alone on the porch swing, her slate untouched beside her, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "May I join you?" Victoria asked gently, waiting for Clara's nod before settling beside her. They sat in silence for a time, the rhythmic creaking of the swing soothing in its predictability. Finally, Victoria spoke, keeping her voice soft and even. "You're thinking about having to see him again, aren't you, Blackwood?" Clara nodded, her fingers twisting anxiously in her lap. "I won't let him hurt you," Victoria promised, taking her sister's hands in her own. "None of us will. You know that, don't you?" Clara nodded again, but her expression remained troubled. She reached for her slate and wrote, "What if he makes me speak?" The question pierced Victoria's heart. Clara's silence wasn't merely a trauma response, it was protection. As long as she couldn't speak, she couldn't testify to what she had witnessed that night in Boston. "No one can make you speak if you're not ready," Victoria assured her. "Not Blackwood, not a judge, not anyone." Clara wrote again, "But what if I want to? What if it's the only way to stop him?" Victoria stared at her sister in surprise. "Clara, are you saying you want to speak about what happened?" Clara's hand trembled as she wrote, "Maybe. For father, for us, but I'm afraid." "Oh, my dear one." Victoria pulled her sister into a gentle embrace. "Of course you're afraid. What you witnessed was terrible. But remember what father always said about courage." Clara looked up questioningly. "He said courage isn't the absence of fear. It's feeling afraid and acting anyway," Victoria reminded her softly. "Whatever you decide whether to speak or remain silent, we will support you completely. But the choice must be yours, freely made." Clara leaned against her sister's shoulder, drawing comfort from the familiar closeness. After a moment, she wrote one more message, "I love you, and I love you," Victoria whispered, pressing a kiss to her sister's hair. "Always and completely." As twilight deepened around them, Victoria held her sister close, painfully aware that tomorrow might bring challenges greater than any they had yet faced. Blackwood was coming, bringing with him the shadow of their past and threats to their future. But they would meet him together, strengthened by bonds both old and new. Whatever happened, the Hartford sisters were no longer alone. The day of Blackwood's arrival dawned clear and bright, the Montana sky a mocking blue above the tension-gripping Sullivan Ranch. By mutual agreement, the Hartford sisters would remain at the ranch while Emmett and Gideon rode into Promise Creek to meet the train, accompanied by Sheriff Wheeler. Wesley would stay behind with Caleb in the ranch hands, ensuring the women's safety. Victoria stood on the porch watching as Emmett and Gideon prepared to depart, her composed exterior, masking the turmoil within. Emmett approached her before mounting, his expression grave but determined. "Remember the plan," he said quietly. "If anything happens in town, anything that suggests Blackwood has outmaneuvered us, Wesley knows what to do. The back trail to the Bridger Pass is provisioned and ready." Victoria nodded, though the thought of fleeing again filled her with both weariness and determination. "Be careful," she said simply. "Blackwood is more dangerous than he appears." "So am I," Emmett replied, a hint of grim humor in his tone. Then more seriously, "Trust me, Victoria, I won't let him win." Impulsively, Victoria reached up and straightened his collar, her hand lingering against the solid warmth of his chest. "I do trust you, more than I've trusted anyone since my father died." Emmett covered her hand with his own, pressing it briefly against his heart before reluctantly stepping away. With a final nod, he mounted his horse and rode out with Gideon, their figures gradually diminishing against the vast Montana landscape. The hours that followed were among the longest of Victoria's life. She moved through the ranch house like a restless ghost, unable to settle to any task, her mind constantly returning to the train station in Promise Creek, imagining the confrontation unfolding there. By mid-afternoon, the waiting had become unbearable. Victoria was considering saddling a horse and riding into town herself when the sound of approaching riders reached them. Wesley, who had been keeping watch from an upstairs window, called down with evident relief. "It's Emmett and Gideon, and they have others with them." Victoria rushed to the porch, her sisters close behind, As the riders came into view, she felt a surge of mixed emotions. Emmett and Gideon rode at the front, their expressions unreadable at this distance. Behind them came Sheriff Wheeler and another man Victoria didn't recognize, distinguished-looking, with silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard. And then bringing up the rear, a sight that made Victoria's heart leap, an elderly gentleman in an impeccable suit, despite the dusty journey, Mr. Jenkins, her father's solicitor, exactly as she remembered him. Noticeably absent was Cornelius Blackwood. As the riders dismounted in the yard, Victoria hurried down the steps, her sisters following. Emmett met her halfway, his expression finally breaking into a smile that transformed his serious features. "It's over," he said, simply taking her hands in his. "Blackwood isn't coming." Victoria stared at him in disbelief. "What? How?" "Perhaps Mr. Jenkins should explain," Emmett suggested, turning to the elderly solicitor, who was now approaching, brushing trail dust from his immaculate suit. "Miss Hartford," Jenkins greeted her with a formal bow. "Or should I say the Mrs. Hartford? How relieved I am to find you all safe and well." "Mr. Jenkins," Victoria replied, emotion making her voice unsteady. "We can't thank you enough for coming. But please, what's happened? Where is Blackwood?" "Currently, I believe he's enjoying the hospitality of the Promise Creek Jail," Jenkins replied with surprising satisfaction. "A most fitting accommodation given the circumstances." "Jail?" Sophia echoed, stepping forward. "On what charges?" "Initially merely for questioning regarding certain financial irregularities," Jenkins explained. "But after Judge Lawrence, he indicated the silver-haired stranger reviewed the documents I brought from Boston. More serious charges are being considered. Fraud, embezzlement, and potentially—" He paused, his gaze moving to Clara, who had pressed close to Caleb's side. "And potentially Miss Clara murder, if you are willing to provide testimony about what you witnessed that night." A shocked silence fell over the group. Clara's eyes widened, her grip on Caleb's arm tightening visibly. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion inside," Emmett suggested, noting Clara's distress. "It's been a long journey for everyone." Once settled in the ranch house parlor, Jenkins elaborated on the remarkable turn of events. After receiving Victoria's telegram, he had gathered all the evidence Abraham Hartford had entrusted to him, duplicate ledgers, correspondence, and most damning of all, a letter written by Hartford himself detailing his suspicions about Blackwood. "Your father was a cautious man," Jenkins explained. "He anticipated Blackwood's betrayal and took precautions. The journals hidden at the lake cottage were only part of his insurance. He left copies of everything with me, with explicit instructions to protect them, and you should anything happen to him." "But why didn't you come forward after his death?" Sophia demanded, a hint of accusation in her tone. Jenkins sighed heavily. "By the time I learned of his death, the trial was already over, the verdict rendered. Blackwood's influence with the courts was considerable, and then you disappeared before I could contact you." "We had no choice," Victoria said quietly. "Blackwood was petitioning for guardianship. We had to leave." "A wise decision, as it turns out," Jenkins acknowledged. "It gave me time to build a more comprehensive case. When I learned from my contacts that Blackwood was heading west, presumably in pursuit of you, I knew the time had come to act." Judge Lawrence, who had been listening silently, now spoke for the first time. "The evidence Mr. Jenkins has presented is compelling. Financial records showing systematic fraud correspondence, implicating Blackwood in misappropriation of patents and company funds. But without testimony regarding my father's death, he could still escape the most serious charges." Victoria realized, her gaze moving to Clara. Clara, who had been writing on her slate, now held it up for all to see. "I want to testify. I want to speak." A murmur ran through the room. Caleb squeezed Clara's hand supportively, while Victoria felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Are you certain, Clara?" she asked gently. "No one would blame you if you weren't ready." Clara nodded firmly, then to everyone's astonishment opened her mouth and spoke, her voice rusty from disuse but clear enough to be understood. "I'm ready." The simple declaration, the first words Clara had spoken in nearly a year, brought tears to Victoria's eyes. Lillian gasped softly while Sophia reached out to clasp her youngest sister's free hand. "Well then," Judge Lawrence said, clearly moved despite his professional demeanor, "I believe we have all we need to ensure Cornelius Blackwood faces the full consequences of his actions." The conversation continued, details discussed, and arrangements made for formal statements to be taken. But Victoria found her attention drawn repeatedly to Clara, who remained close to Caleb's side but seemed transformed, as if the decision to speak to confront her fears had lifted a tremendous weight from her young shoulders. Eventually, as the afternoon waned, Jenkins and Judge Lawrence departed for town, accompanied by Sheriff Wheeler. They would return the following day for Clara's official statement, but for now, the Hartford sisters and Sullivan brothers were left to absorb the remarkable turn of events. "I can hardly believe it's over," Lillian said softly as they gathered on the porch, watching the sunset over the Montana landscape. "After so long living in fear." "It's not quite over," Wesley reminded her gently. "There will be legal proceedings, testimony to give. But the worst is behind us." Victoria, standing slightly apart with Emmett, felt a profound sense of both relief and disorientation. For so long, her every decision, every action had been shaped by the need to protect her sisters from Blackwood. With that threat neutralized, what would guide her now? As if sensing her thoughts, Emmett spoke quietly. "What will you do now, Victoria? With Blackwood facing justice, you could return to Boston if you wished. Reclaim your father's property, rebuild your lives there." If Victoria considered this possibility, turning it over in her mind like a strange artifact from another life. Boston, with its familiar streets and social conventions, its theaters and libraries and drawing rooms. It had been home once. But as she looked around at the scene before her, Gideon and Sophia engaged in one of their spirited debates, Wesley and Lillian sharing a book, Clara actually speaking softly to Caleb, her voice gaining strength with each word, Victoria realized a profound truth. "No," she said finally, meeting Emmett's gaze. "Boston isn't home anymore. This is." The simple declaration seemed to release something in Emmett's expression, a tension she hadn't fully recognized until it was gone. "You're certain?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral, despite the hope in his eyes. Victoria smiled, reaching for his hand. "I've never been more certain of anything. My sisters and I belong here now. With you. With all of you." Emmett's fingers tightened around hers, his scarred face transformed by a smile that reached his eyes. "Then stay. Not as guests, not as mail-order brides who never quite arrived as planned. Stay as family." As the Montana sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Victoria Hartford stood beside Emmett Sullivan. Their hands joined, their futures intertwined. Behind them, the laughter and conversation of their siblings, for they were all family now, regardless of blood, created a melody of belonging. They had all been wounded in their different ways. They had all carried burdens too heavy for any one person to bear alone. But here on this land that demanded both strength and tenderness, they had found more than sanctuary. They had found home. And as Emmett drew her closer, his arms strong around her shoulders, Victoria finally allowed herself to release the last remnants of fear. The journey that had begun in desperate flight from Boston had led somehow to exactly where she was meant to be. 4 sisters, 4 brothers, 8 souls who had found healing on barren land. It was enough. It was everything. In the deepening twilight, as stars began to appear in the vast Montana sky, Victoria Hartford lifted her face to Emmett Sullivan's and sealed their unspoken promise with a kiss. Not an ending, but a beginning. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together on this land that had become their own. Home at last.